Welcome to today's edition of Less Stress Parenting, our webinar series to hopefully help all of you parents and some professionals that are on the phone find some resources and some great people that can help you out with whatever you need related to your children or students or patients in some cases. Today, we're going to talk about a very hot topic. Last year we did this and had tremendous requests for doing it again. And so I want to welcome you all to learning about whether your child needs a 504 plan or an IEP and help you understand the differences. And with us today is Frances Shefter, who I absolutely adore. She's one of the best in the industry. And I'm so excited that she could find time to spend with us today because she really doesn't have a lot of free time. And so let me briefly introduce her. I'm sure many of you know her, and then she can elaborate. So as I said, we're privileged to have her here today. She is from Shefter Law, and she's a former teacher who turned an education attorney. Big thing here is she knows the education space and she's an attorney, so she's a great advocate to have. She uniquely bridges the gap between the classroom and the courtroom. With experiences ranging from leading the special education department to advocating at IEP tables, she's uniquely positioned, having played roles from an educator to an attorney and even as a parent. So let's dive into understanding IEPs and 504 plans with Frances guiding us. Thank you so much for joining us, Frances. And as a fellow attorney, I just love that you do this. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, and we will get started. If anyone has questions, please put them in the Q&A box and we will read them at the end and go through them so Frances can answer all your questions at the end. I hope you enjoy the programming. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you for having me. Okay, why isn't it click? There it goes. Okay. So IEP versus 504 plan, what's the difference? I get this question all of the time, and I see on the Facebook mom groups all of the time people saying, oh, you need an IEP, oh, you need a 504. And usually, sometimes it's not the right advice. So I want to start a little bit about me, just so you know my background. My education, I started off, I got my undergraduate degree in early childhood education. Then I moved to Florida and became a teacher. I taught general education, kindergarten, and I was a reading specialist. And then my heart was always with special education, but my undergrad didn't have that. So I went back to school to get certified in special education, and then did my master's degree in special education. After 7 years in the classroom, I moved up to, it was elementary school, to a middle and high school. And within 2 months of there, I wound up becoming the special education coordinator, which is the one that runs the IEP meetings. After 2 years, it just didn't feel right anymore. I didn't feel like it was about the kids, and I didn't feel like I was making the difference that I wanted to make, because I went into education to make a difference in kids' lives. So one thing led to another, and I wound up at law school, which was a surprise to myself because it really started with me just taking the LSATs. And then when I moved back up to Maryland, I became an education attorney, which was combining the two careers. So I've been at the table as a general education teacher, a special education teacher, the LEA, and the education attorney. And then I'm also a mom of 2 young children. One is on an IEP, and I just found out the other will be going on an IEP shortly. So I have that experience as well, which helps me empathize with my clients, with all the clients, because I've been there. I know what it's like when you're sitting at an IEP meeting and everybody's talking about your child. So I always like to say that I'm the only person in the IEP meeting that can say that they've sat in five different locations in the table, which brings a unique perspective. So let's dive in to the differences. So the first major difference is the law. IDEA is a federal law that for education law with students with disabilities. And Section 504 is in the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which is the federal civil rights law to stop discrimination against people with disabilities. So there's a little bit of difference there. It's discrimination, and then it's the education of. The purpose of the laws. The IEP So the IDEA that focuses on the IEP is on the student's progress in relation to their own potential and unique needs. So you're looking at where is the child able to achieve and what are their needs to get there. Whereas the 504 plan focuses on whether the student's disabilities are, student with disabilities are receiving educational services that are as effective as those made available to their non-disabled peers. So that's access to the curriculum. That it's evening the playing field so that kids with disabilities have those extra supports so that they can compete with their general education peers on the same level. So funding comes from, and that people don't realize this, so federal funding, is sent to states and local agencies, and that's why they have to follow the law. And if there are too many complaints, it can impact a state or a county's even funding from the federal law. And 504, they do not get federal funds. They're required to do it, and they may not use IDEA funds to implement anything from a 504. Procedural safeguards. So these are, if you've ever been to an IEP meeting, this is the stack of like 25 to 30 pages that they hand you and say, oh, you understand this, right? And they hand it over. So in IDEA, it's required components of the written notice regarding identification, evaluation, replacement, and notice before any change in placement. Like those are the main things on the procedural safeguards. And just as an FYI, I have procedural safeguards on one page that there'll be a link, a QR code later for you guys to scan to get a copy of that. With 504 plans, the parents have to get notice regarding the identification, evaluation, or placement, but it doesn't have to be in writing. So it's a lot less stringent. But there also has to be notice before a significant change in placement. And interestingly, I actually have a case right now. I was doing some research on it with suspensions. If you know anything about IDEA, a child with an IEP cannot be suspended without more than 10 days. It's considered a change of placement, and there has to be a manifestation determination meeting. That's the same with 504. If your child's suspended more than 10 days in any given school year, so it doesn't have to be consecutive, it's considered a significant change in placement. And there are things that the school is required to follow, and it is a violation of procedural safeguards for 504 plans. Okay, sorry, and I'm probably talking too fast. That's an occupational hazard, but I have a lot of information I want to get through. So eligibility. This is the biggest thing, is like, how do you get eligible and what's the difference? So with an IEP, you have to have a disability. The difference between the IEP and the 504 plan is that for an IEP, the disability has to fall into one of 13 categories, which are autism, deafblindness, deafness, emotional disturbance, hearing impaired, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, specific learning disability, speech or language, traumatic brain injury, or visual impairment. So that you have to fit into one of those categories, which is frustrating because special needs are special. Our kids are special, right? And sometimes they don't fit into one of those little categories, but we know they need the extra supports. But that's a whole nother issue. The next is that, the child needs the special education related services. So they cannot access the general education curriculum without some specialized instruction and some additional related services. There also needs to be an educational impact. So just having a disability doesn't automatically qualify you for an IEP. You have to have an educational impact. And that's that it affects the child's educational performance and ability to learn and benefit from the general education curriculum. There are some exclusionary factors, which is lack of instruction in reading, lack of instruction in math, and ESOL. So those can't be the reason a child's found eligible for special education. So it's basically if a child hasn't gone to school for the first 6 years of their life because they were, somewhere that they didn't have schooling, then they haven't been instructed. So the fact that they're below level is because of the lack of instruction. IDEA also requires in the IEP that there's a team of specific members. So it's always persons with knowledge of the student, and it must include a special education teacher, a general education teacher, someone who can interpret evaluation results, which is usually the school psychologist, the LEA, which is the district representative with authority over special education. Sometimes that's a special ed coordinator, sometimes it's the principal, it depends on how the school, and the parent, of course. And that's to remember, we're all equal members of the team. It's not one above the other. We're all equal members. And then if your child is being considered for any related services, speech, OT, physical therapy, then those related services people should be invited as well. For a 504 plan, there needs to be a physical or mental impairment. And that means that there's difficulties with walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, learning, working, caring for oneself, and performing manual tasks, or is what falls under an impairment. This also covers any disability. So there's no specific categories. It's almost any disability if it's considered an impairment and it substantially limits one or more life activities. And the basic life activities that relate to school are issues with learning, reading, communicating, and thinking. And that's the thinking is our ADHD kids. That's where it comes in often there. And so they first qualify for that, they have a disability is the first step on the 504 plan eligibility. Then the next is it interfering with their ability to learn? Is the disability impacting them so much that they're not accessing the general education curriculum for whatever reason? There's also a team to determine, and it's persons with knowledge of the student, which may include the parent, general and special education teachers, and school principal. There's no requirement for a 504 plan. And I get that often. They're like, well, the counselor met with me and we did a 504 plan. Is that legal? Technically it is. So when do you bring that up as an issue if what they're putting in the 504 plan you don't think is appropriate? So then we go into evaluations and placement, which are also, there are some similarities and some differences between IEPs and 504 plans. So for an IEP, before you can do an evaluation, there must be parental consent. So the parents have to consent to an evaluation. Looking at eligibility, there needs to be information from a variety of sources. And as I said before, the group of persons with knowledge of the student. So it needs to be the IEP team, and it needs to be people that know the student. So it can't just be, oh, grab the PE teacher and grab the English teachers, the gen ed, and grab special ed teacher from the, from the class over there as a special ed teacher that have no knowledge of the student. It really needs to be somebody that has knowledge of the student, if at all possible. And then when you come to placement, there's the continuum of services, and that's when you look at the least restrictive environment. So does the child need to be in general education classroom with supports? Is that enough? Do they need to be pulled out for services? Do they need to be in self-contained for some classes or co-taught for some classes? We need to look at the continuum of services and determine the least restrictive environment that the child can make progress towards the general education curriculum. There must be a meeting before a change in placement. So the school can't just say, oh, this isn't working, we're going to put them in a self-contained classroom. They have to have an IEP meeting, and it needs to be discussed and reviewed, and the parents need to support. If the parents don't agree, that's when you file for due process and get stay put. But that's that could be a whole other presentation on its own as well. With the IEPs, reevaluation must occur every 3 years. So that doesn't mean that the child has to be evaluated every 3 years, although usually I highly recommend it. It means that the IEP team needs to meet and discuss and determine if any additional evaluations are needed to be able to determine eligibility and to determine, to be able to educationally plan. So for example, I had an IEP meeting this week with a child, a high school kid, that we know has intellectual disabilities. He qualifies. We know that the teachers have been on top of everything, you know, doing the standardized tests, doing everything else. And the teachers feel that they have enough information to educationally plan. So my client, the educational decision maker, and myself agreed that there's no reason to put this child through any additional testing. We know he's still ID. It's not like you could change with that. And if we have, as a team, have enough to develop a plan without a testing, then we wouldn't do testing. But again, that's on an individual basis. Oftentimes, I'll recommend that you get at least academic testing every 3 years, if not more often. So for a 504 plan, if the school wants to evaluate, they need to give the parent notice, but the parents don't have to consent. The school just has to say, we're looking at your child for a 504 plan, and then they can do whatever evaluations. Again, it's information from a variety of sources. So it can't just be like one teacher saying, you know, what's going on. There needs to be looking at outside people, the parents, and everything else. Again, a group of persons with knowledge of the student. Again, they need to be with, you know, people that know about the student. So not just people that generally know about, you know, traumatic brain injury or generally know about deafness. It's somebody that actually knows this child and their unique needs. There is also needs to be how the child's being educated with non-disabled peers. So there needs to be that information in the 504 plan needs to be discussed. And then there's no meeting for a change of placement. And like, this is the stuff that people don't realize with 504 plans. There's still a lot of the same laws and rules. It's just not as strict and well-defined as an IDEA. But when you look, and the federal government leaves it up to the local educational agencies to determine stuff. So you got to then go down to the next level and see what your county is doing. The recommendation is for the 504 plans policy and procedure to follow the same as IDEA, because then you know you're complying, but that doesn't mean everybody's doing it. And then generally a reevaluation is done every 3 years, but it's not mandated, it's not required. The 504 plan also needs to be reviewed annually, like it does on the IEP, but with reevaluations, if there's a need, then they'll do it, but it's not always done. And then FAPE, free and appropriate public education. Everybody talks about FAPE in relationship to IEPs, but it falls under 504 as well. So with IEPs, it's specifically designed instruction is what needs to be done for FAPE. It needs to meet the student's unique needs. So it can't be, oh, child's deaf, this is what we put in the IEP. No, child's not hearing, but can do X, Y, Z, and so these are the needs, and you need to look at it. The IEP also has related services, which are your speech, OT, PT, are the generals. And there needs to be the full educational opportunity. So that's that the child can be educated to the full extent possible. It's no more of this that the special ed kids are put in the back room and, you know, never really seen again. They need to be in and educated to the full, you know, have that full educational opportunity. There are also specific contents in the IEP. There are 8 parts: the present levels, measurable goals, how progress is going to be measured and when it's going to be reported, special education and related services, supplementary aids and services, participating with non-disabled peers, the timing of services, when's it going to start, when's it going to end, and accommodations and transitions. Transitions start when the child turns 14. It varies depending on your state, but it's generally 14. And that's when the school is supposed to be looking at what is the plan for the child after graduation, and what is the school doing to help that child be prepared for after graduation. For the 504 plan, it needs to be appropriate, comparable. So it's kind of general on where it needs to be. There's also can be related services on a 504 plan. You can get behavior support, you can get occupational therapy, you can get physical therapy on a 504 plan if that's what your child needs. And there's only, I think it's occupational therapy can't be a qualification on its own for an IEP. So that's why you would get OT on a 504 plan if your child doesn't qualify for an IEP under something else. There needs to be a development of a plan, but there's no like specific parts of the plan that need to be there. It just needs to have a plan. And scarily, a written plan is not mandated. So federal law does not require a 504 plan to be mandated, to be written, which is kind of scary because then how do you know it's there? But that again, this is what federal law requires. And what is it that the local education agency, what's their policy, or even the state, like looking in Maryland at COMAR, what are the regulations there that the state requires? Ways to resolve disputes. This is always a big one because what do you do when the school's not doing what they're supposed to be doing? Which is obviously a lot of what my firm does, is holding schools accountable. So what are there things you can do to resolve a dispute? And first is you can file for mediation. Maryland has the form. I think almost every state has the form of what you can do. You can write your own, but there is specifics of what needs to be in the complaint. And you file for mediation, and then you and the other side and an administrative law judge that is not acting as a judge, just acting as a mediator, come to the table and try to see if you can find a solution, like meet on middle ground. Mediation is weird. I've been to several times. There's been times I've walked in and they've gone, nope, nothing. We're not offering you anything. It's this or nothing or anything else, which means, okay, we'll litigate it. And there's times I've walked in and they've gone, yeah, here, we're giving you everything you want. So it's hard to say which way. Sometimes it depends on the instructional specialist. I hate to say this, but the truth is sometimes it depends on how busy they are. So how much is it worth litigating at this point when they have other things to litigate? Oops, I realized I didn't clip. The next is the due process complaint, and that's going to litigation. Oftentimes we file mediation and due process together to show that we will litigate if we don't resolve in mediation. And it also gets that timeline, the due process timeline, started a lot faster. When you file a due process complaint, if both sides if you do not file for mediation, or if you file and the school refuses to mediate because they have to agree, then you have what's called a resolution session. And that's similar to mediation of trying to find a middle ground, but there's no mediator involved. It's just the school system and the parent, and then attorneys if they bring them. And then the other thing is a state complaint. So is the state complaint's kind of the easy one to do, because you just have to file a state complaint and then the state actually looks at the issues and determines if there's something going on. I did that once in a case, and the school basically was doing everything wrong, as I knew, and the state found out, and then the state writes a report of what the school needs to do to systemically change so that it doesn't keep happening. And they also do a requirement of what they need to do for the individual child. What's also nice about the state complaint is if you win a state complaint, you can file for due process, staple the state complaint to it, which means you've pretty much already won the case, but you can then go for more than what the state said you could get as remedy. And then there's filing for lawsuit. In the IEPs, though, you need to exhaust your administrative, the administrative process before you can file a lawsuit. And that means you need to go through full due process, and you lose at due process, then you can file a lawsuit in the next level. So that's where that is. And I'll get to the 504 plan where it's different. 504 plan, you also have mediation. You have what they call alternative dispute resolution. They also have an impartial hearing, so you can file for due process. Instead of a state complaint, they have a complaint to the Office of Civil Rights. And with an OCR complaint, again, it's filing the complaint under each law that, like, you can list the law that was broken and what the school did for the discrimination. And then the Office of Civil Rights either determines to take it or not. And they say if they're not taking it, it's not because there's not a case there. It's just not where it's not something they can take right now. Because if, as you can imagine, OCR is slammed with filings constantly. And then there's also the lawsuit in 504 plan. There was a recent case with Supreme Court. There was a huge win for parents. It was the Perez case. It was about a student who was deaf, whose aide did not know sign language. So basically the student sat there for 3 years of high school with no communication, not knowing what's going on because the aide was sitting with him, but wasn't communicating with him. And what the Supreme Court said is that you can file for damages under ADA without having exhausted the administrative due process. So in this case, they settled with the county for the due process claim. So they came to a settlement agreement, but then they filed in federal court for discrimination under 504. And the Supreme Court said you can absolutely 100% do that, which was a huge win because that's also looking at when you're in federal court, you can get monetary damages, which you can't necessarily get from the school system. So all this to say, what do you need to consider? Like, how do you know? Like, okay, this is the process. This is, I get IEP, I get 504, but how do you know what your child needs? And those are the most important things because it's not, you know, people say, oh, you need an IEP, it's more teeth, and you can, the school has to follow it. Because the school has to follow a 504 plan as well. It's really looking at your child and what your child needs. So, I mean, the first thing to consider is, does your child meet one of the 13 categories? There's very specific categories, and if you look up in IDEA, it describes what each category is and what the qualifications are for each, you know, category of what a student needs to have to meet those qualifications. If they do, then that looks like an IEP. Is there a record of a physical or mental impairment? So does the child have a diagnosis? Here's the thing, the school can't require a medical diagnosis in order for a 504 plan. They can do evaluations, and school can't diagnose, but the school can say has symptoms of and appears to have the need under ADHD or whatever that may be. So that's a little thing that schools like to say, well, you need to go to your doctor and get a diagnosis. And that's not 100% true. Does your child need specific goals? Are there things that your child specifically needs to work on that is not just an accommodation? For example, is your child having a hard time with basic math facts? So, okay, an accommodation could be using a calculator, but is that enough? Or does your child need a teacher to specifically work on the math facts and teaching your child? And that brings to the need for special education services. Does the child need that pullout? Does the child need that specific attention working on a goal? That looks more towards an IEP. And then, are accommodations enough? Is it just, you know what, if he has extra time, he has somebody reading the directions to him, then he does fine, then you're looking at, okay, maybe a 504 plan is more appropriate. And then where can the needs be met? Does the student need to be pulled out for services, or can everything be met in the general education setting? That's not an exclusionary, you know, that's not a, oh, then it has to be a 504 or it has to be an IEP. But obviously, if a child's needs can't be met in the general education setting and needs to be in a special education setting, then you're looking at an IEP. And that's like classroom size, extra teachers, extra adult support and stuff. And this is what I always tell all parents. Trust your gut. Our parental instincts are right. If something's up, something's going on, don't take no for an answer. Keep pushing until you get what your child needs. You don't necessarily need to know exactly what your child needs, but if you feel like this doesn't feel right, something's not sitting right with me, trust that gut and go find more information and push the envelope. Like don't just take no and say, oh, okay, just keep going up, going higher, talk to an advocate, talk to an attorney, go research on the web, whatever it is, but trust that gut, because it's there for a reason. And I know when I've ignored it, it's always been not good results. And when I've followed it, it's always good. And so that's all parents. We have that gut feeling for a reason. Now, the buzz phrases. I know that's the important thing that everybody always wants to know is like, what do I say if we're sitting at the meeting and the school is saying, nope, nope, nope. So one of the buzz phrases is specialized instruction. It was actually interesting. I had an attorney tell me at an IEP meeting that I can't use that because it's a legal phrase. I'm like, yeah, it's a legal term, but if that's what the child needs, it's really interesting. But that attorney was also very interesting. So the child needs specialized instruction. What does that look like? I had an IEP meeting one time that there was no question the child had a disability, but there was question of whether an IEP was needed or not. This was a middle school child. And, the central office person said, well, what goals? And I said, oh, okay, these are the goals that the child needs. And that's when the central office person said, oh, okay, I could see that. And so knowing specific goals is helpful so that you can come back with, but he needs to be taught executive functioning skills. She needs to be taught social skills. Just having supports are not enough. Somebody needs to actually go in and teach her how to socialize. They need basic math skills. Those all come to your specialized instruction. The other is the interventions didn't work. Was the school doing research-based interventions? Were you doing outside tutoring? What was going on? And the child is still struggling and still not getting up to grade level. And here's the thing. They're not required. It's not required. Research-based intervention, the school can't say, well, we need to evaluate for 6 weeks and put in some research-based intervention strategies before to see if they work or not. Because if they work, it's not special education. Well, just because you haven't been collecting data at school doesn't mean there's not data there. So it doesn't need to be formal collection. And you as a parent can be collecting the data. If you've had an outside tutor, there's your data. The tutor's been working this amount of time and the child's not going. I've had schools say not progressing the way they should. I've had schools say, well, yes, they've been in research-based intervention class, but we don't really have any data. Well, that's your fault for not collecting the data. That's not enough. If the child's at A at the beginning of school and still at A at the end of school, there's no progress. Something's going on there. SLD, this is always a big one. So they'll say 2 standard deviations below. What does that mean? It's a 15-point spread between achievement score and intelligence score. So if your IQ is 107, anything below 77 on your achievement score is 2 standard deviations below and will get you qualified for SLD. But here's the important thing. Look at the subtests as well, because a lot of times, especially with our kids with dyslexia and dysgraphia, they are able to compensate because they're smart kids and they're able to compensate so much so that on the surface, you don't see what's going on. But then when you look down at the specific subtests, a lot of times those the subtests are where they're low, but because other scores are high, the general score is high. So for example, so DC does 1.5 standard deviations. So 7, a score of 7 in the subtest is 1, a score of 2 is 2. So, okay, the kid, a score of 6 is 2 deviations below. So, I'm talking to the psychologist and I said, so in other words, if a child has 6 in subtest, then they qualify? She goes, yes. I'm like, so spelling, and then I don't remember the other 2 are all 6. She goes, yeah, she qualifies. And that was the end of the conversation. The kid qualifies. It's 2 standard deviations below. So know the terminology and what you're looking at so that you can point it out to them. Because you know what? They make mistakes sometimes. The other thing is masking at school. So I've seen oftentimes that the kid, we don't see that in school. We don't see that behavior in school. That's a home problem, not a school problem. And what I always like to bring up is that the child's masking at school and holding it together. So what then the child gets home and falls apart because they just can't anymore. And I always like to say in the IEP meetings that think about when you've had a really stressful, rough day at work and you wanted to cuss out everybody, you wanted to punch everybody, but you held it together because you knew you would lose your job. And then you came home and let it all out, had a glass of wine, went for a run, whatever your thing is, ate a pint of ice cream, whatever your thing is when you're that stressed. So you let it all out. Well, this is a child that's doing this every day, 5 days a week. If the child had the special ed services and supports they needed, they wouldn't have to mask. They could be themselves, and it will then alleviate the issues that are happening at home, which do impact school. And the other phrase I always tell people, which, everybody laughs at it, but just say you talked to an attorney and she said, you don't even necessarily have to have a consultation or a strategy session, as we call them, with an attorney. Just saying I talked to an attorney and they said is changing. Like I've had schools say like they were disagreeing with what the code should be. And my client said, well, I was talking to an attorney. And all of a sudden the special ed coordinator said, oh, okay, you wanted the autism code? Okay, we'll use the autism code. Because they didn't want an attorney to come. So there are oftentimes using that will work. Not long-term or for placement issues usually, but I always say, try it. If it works, great. If it doesn't, then call us and we'll talk about something else. So I hope I didn't talk too fast. I know it was a lot of information. I wanted to get through it all. But you can follow me on social media. My YouTube channel that you see there on the bottom has over 100 short videos of all areas of the special ed process, 504, eligibility, PWN, what to do when types videos. Also my show, I have a podcast called Stress Free IEP that's live on Facebook most Tuesdays at noon. And all of those episodes are also on my YouTube channel and my website. And for the free information that I promised you, if you all want to pop out your phones and do this scan me, it will bring you to my webpage where I have free downloadable. So there's first the procedural safeguards on one page, hits the highlights of what you need to know. There's also the special education acronyms, which I don't even have all of them on there, and I think it's 3 pages. But those are really important to know because it's just teachers tend to use them, and being familiar with them is helpful. There's also for IEP goals. What are you looking for? What questions to ask? And there's a presentation I did for the Lehigh Symposium for Special Education on ESY appropriateness. So guess what? The schools are all doing it wrong on what they're doing for ESY. But again, that's a whole nother presentation I could do. You can download the presentation on my website. And here is my contact information. Frances Shefter, Shefter Law. We're based in Rockville. We provide legal services in Maryland, DC, Florida, and New Jersey currently. We can provide advocacy services nationwide and in American schools overseas. So I hope I didn't talk too fast again. And here we are for questions. And I think, Wendy, I'm sure you probably have some, or the audience has some. So go ahead.
Absolutely. We have a number of questions. Thank you so much for sharing all of that incredibly helpful information. So let me start with, how does a twice exceptional classification influence a 504 versus an IEP?
I mean, it still goes back to the basics needs of the child. 2E, those are kids that, again, it's harder because it's the masking, because a lot of times our 2E kids have their intelligence kind of hide the other things. But it's, again, looking at the evaluations, looking at what the recommendations are and what your child needs. Sometimes 2E kids, a 504 plan is fine. And then sometimes, the disability is strong enough that they need the instruction. So like our 2E kids that have autism, oftentimes they need instruction on the social skills. So then you're looking at an IEP. Or our 2E kids that have ADHD, you're looking at executive functioning training and actual skills. So then you would look at an IEP.
Perfect. I'm going to piggyback on one that just came back in that's closely related, but is it typical to have both an IEP and a 504, or do you really just need one?
You really just need one because an IEP can do everything that a 504 plan can do because of the accommodations. But that being said, when you're going into college, that's when you're looking at ADA, which is more of a 504 plan, but not, if it's a state school if it's a school that gets federal funds, they have to have a 504 plan. They have to follow 504. So, but when it comes to IEPs in the public schools, it's having an IEP is enough.
Okay, great. And another quick question before I get into a couple of long ones. Can I request an IEP by myself as a parent, or do I need to hire an education advocate?
No, you can 100% ask. There is actually, it's on my website and my YouTube channel, also on timelines. When you ask for a meeting, the school technically has 30 days. I shouldn't say technically, legally, by federal law, has 30 days to come to the table and discuss your concerns. It's called a child find meeting in Montgomery County, and talk about whether the child meets the criteria for eligibility, whether the child doesn't, or whether additional evaluations are needed. And that's why I have my YouTube channel with all that information out there, because technically you should, as parents, be able to do it on your own. I'm here if you need the support, but go watch the YouTube channel, teach yourself how to do it. And I hope you guys can all do it on your own, seriously, because that means the school's doing what they're legally supposed to do.
Yeah, that's always the best way to do it. But unfortunately, sometimes your services are very needed.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see here. Would love to hear how to support parents to navigate the process in their school to get the kiddos an IEP or a 504 plan. I work in mental health and support our clients with school. I've noticed a lot of parents either don't know that IEP or 504s exist or are unsure what to do. And I think that the answer is point them to your YouTube channel.
Exactly.
So I think that's a pretty quick answer. One other one, let's see here. We have a bunch, so I'm trying to get through them quickly. How can a parent and students enforce what's in their IEP? Have a kiddo advocating and she is not getting her own accommodations.
That again is bringing it to the level that they're denying FAPE because they're not implementing the IEP. Mm-hmm. And you call an IEP meeting and then you keep going higher. A lot of times when it's to that level, you'll need to bring in an advocate or attorney. And I would probably recommend an attorney, because while I love advocates and they're great and they're definitely have their position, you don't get central office involved unless you have an attorney involved. And that's when things get changed, is when central office says, oh, wait a minute, school, you're not quite doing that right.
Yeah, the legal repercussions always get you a little bit further.
Yeah, exactly.
Question about a child who was in public schools in Montgomery County as an elementary school and had a 504, but then she was moved to private school for extra attention. And now they want to put her back in high school. Is it possible to then get an IEP rather than a 504, or what is the best method there? They just don't want, the person's asking because they don't want the child to be in a class with a number of other, like a pull-out class where it's all kids that have severe learning differences.
So it's, yeah, I have a couple clients doing this actually. And what they did is they contacted us because the school was ignoring them. But what you can do is you reach out to Montgomery County Public School, or whatever county, I think you said Montgomery County.
It is Montgomery. Yeah.
Yeah. Reach out to the school and say that you're enrolling, but you wanted to start the special education process so that you can get it started so that you have a placement when school starts, is always what I recommend. And there's no IEPs and 504s, like you can't say, oh, you can never get one. Like it's today you might qualify, tomorrow you might not, the next day you might. Like it's not like it's a living, breathing, document that keeps going and changing. So, if they didn't have qualified before, it doesn't mean they won't qualify now.
Okay, so we have a question related to handwriting and spelling evaluations and services for middle schools who don't have a 504. I don't want to say that today, but is really struggling sort of with the OT side of things. How should they progress? Should they go first to the OT person and get an evaluation, or just talk to the school at first to see what's needed?
So OT is difficult to get because there needs to be an educational impact. And with today's technology, like if your handwriting is the issue, there's speech to text, there's typing. And the school says those are accommodations that are perfectly fine that we can put in place. So your kid never needs to know how to write, which is frustrating because you need to know how to write, but that's where it is. So it's difficult to get OT. And again, it's looking at, is it just OT your child needs, or is it more? You can start with an OT ask for an OT consult, but I would start it as a child find meeting. Is that your child is having issues with handwriting? Be specific, do it in writing to the principal that you are requesting a child find meeting, that you suspect OT as an issue so that you have an OT person there as well.
Okay. And then what about issues like asthma, and other types of medical issues like this that cause a child to be out of school a lot? Does that allow for an IEP or some other plan so that they're able to get that assistance when coming back to school? Or, sometimes, as some kids end up at home for a while and have to have assistance at home because they're sick.
So there is what's called a health plan, which is a whole nother document that you get filled out with the physician and put a health plan in place. When it gets to the level of missing a lot of school, oftentimes a 504 plan is enough. But if there are other things that are going on, then you'll look at an IEP. If it's long-term that the child's going to be at home or out of school, that's when you want to talk to them about like home and hospital instruction. Which is different than the whatever they call, I don't remember what Montgomery County calls it, IIS, I think, but it's different because IIS is regular education, not special education. But home and hospital is when a special education teacher or regular education teacher comes and gives you instruction in the home.
Thank you for answering that. A little of a nuanced question. How long should somebody wait for asking for an IEP or a 504 when they're noticing that a child is starting to fall behind and is struggling with attention, especially things like ADHD? How long should they wait before they reach out to the school?
They shouldn't. As soon as you see an issue, your child's struggling, the sooner the better. It's all studies have shown, like early childhood, the earlier you get services, the better. Never, ever, ever let them say, wait and see. That is the worst thing in the world. The sooner you get your child services, the better it is. And there might be, if you catch it early enough and you instruct early enough and you have outside tutors as well as inside, that the child will get all the tools they need to be successful in middle school. Whereas if you wait too long and the struggles, it's the self-confidence of the child is falling apart because the child is struggling so much and has struggled for so many years. And when are they going to just give up? Why should I try anymore? So as soon as you notice an issue, don't wait. I write that letter immediately.
Yeah, we work with a lot of kids that come into us for the executive function coaching. And the underpinning of what we do is build self-confidence and self-esteem, but you have to go back and explain that you just didn't have the tools. So once you have the tools and you make baby steps of accomplishment, it really helps kids feel that confidence, like they can attack whatever's in front of them. But it does take time, and it's better to get in early, 100%. So one parent is trying to get an IEP meeting, and she asked for it 2 weeks ago and has sort of been pushed, getting the kick the can down the road from the school, saying that they're busy with other things and they have to figure out a time to meet. How long should she wait before she pushes? I'll let you answer. I know the answer too, but go ahead.
Right now, write a letter to the principal, CC special education office. and say federal law requires a meeting within 30 days. I did this request on this date. I was talking to an attorney and they said, all of that stuff, throw it in writing and you'll see how quick, especially if you CC to central office and to their legal department, because they know what's coming next. So I would not wait any longer because schools, I've had schools kick the can for 6 months before the clients came to me. And look, that's 6 months of your child's life, which it's a lot when you're talking about a kid's education and a kid struggling. So don't wait, just do it. Like be that. Here's the thing. I remember when I was a teacher, we had that parent and I said, oh, I'm never going to be that parent when I grow up. And I'm like, guess what? I'm that parent and there's nothing wrong with it because these are my kids. So be that parent and don't let them like, oh, we have other stuff. That's nice. Federal law says you need to do this. So what are you doing?
Right.
It's not an excuse.
Okay, we have 2 other questions and then I think we're going to be done because I want to close out and get everybody out on time, including you, Frances. So let's see here. Does IEP apply to behavioral challenges? And if a child has ASD and has gotten expelled from multiple schools because of impulse control, he's been denied services, should he be reevaluated? So those are 2 parts. So first is, does an IEP cover behavioral changes?
100%. 100%. That's where, like, hearing a child's been expelled, if the child has an IEP, something's wrong. If the child doesn't have an IEP, something's wrong. Because has there been a manifestation determination meeting? If the behaviors are a manifestation of the disability, meaning that it's, impulse control, because the child's ASD and doesn't have impulse control, that's a manifestation of the disability. And then that's when you need to be looking at a different placement, a more restrictive environment, because it's not working. And so that's, I would say, call my office definitely, because that's one that would be like straight to due process. If a child's not going, behaviors are, that's the thing. It's not the day and age of like, well, the kid should know better. Well, but yes, the kid does know better. But if they have issues with impulse control, they know better, but that frontal lobe's not working to say, yeah, that's not a good idea. They're saying, oh, let's go jump here and do that. They're going to do it before even thinking twice. So it's definitely an issue.
So 2 quick other questions. A really great one, which is what do private schools offer and can you get anything from private schools? So let's just start with that one real quick.
So private schools still have to follow ADA. So they have to provide accommodations as long as it doesn't materially affect the program. So for example, they have to have wheelchair access, things like that. But that also goes for kids with ADHD and stuff if they need the extra time, as long as it's not materially affecting the curriculum, then they have to provide. There's also that you can get services from the county if your child's in private school. This county still has a requirement to provide services to an extent.
Perfect. And some of the private schools have a lot of learning specialists that really are helpful and want to help your child. I just want to add that we do work with both public school and private school students, and it really depends on the school. We make it our business to try to figure out, we're not educational consultants, but when we work with students, we are always asked what schools would probably be better for a student. And we'll usually refer to an education consultant, but at the same time, we also know from working with the schools which ones tend to be more friendly to more structure for a child. Okay, last question, and then we're going to close out quickly, is how do you know what to ask for? If your kid is behind and they're needing to get help, is the school required to do an evaluation? Like, how do you figure out what they need?
School is required to do an evaluation. You write the letter that your child's struggling, where you are, the child's struggling, and you just write your letter you just write your letter of your child struggling. This is what you're seeing, and you are requesting a child find meeting.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Frances. I want to wrap up today's session and extend a huge thank you to Frances for sharing her invaluable insights and her invaluable time with us. So thank you for joining us today and making time to be here. A big thank you to our attendees also for their active participation, especially those who posed great questions, sparking a lovely discussion at the end. And for anyone wishing to delve deeper or reach out directly to Frances, please review her contact information that she provided, use the QR code, and please feel free to reach out to her directly. She is a wealth of knowledge, I can promise that. Also, we're here, Illuminos is here to help. We offer comprehensive 360-degree support for each of our students that is completely customized for them. Our program provides personal guidance. We ensure that students not only learn, but thrive in their educational journeys. We work with everybody in the circle of support, including folks like Frances, to make sure that your child is getting the information shared with everybody and that they are hearing similar things from everyone as we all work to support that child. We do watch, we want kids to feel accountable, but we want them to be, and we also want them to be independent. And so we work hard to do all of that. So you can reach us anytime on our website, illuminos.co. There's no N on the end. And you can find us there. We do free consultations for like 45 minutes, an hour, whatever parents need to figure out if it's the right solution. And you can always follow us. We post a lot of information, including like Frances's great stuff on our website. On our social media. So we are on Instagram and we're on Twitter, which is now, I guess, called X. I'm sorry, I can't get used to that. And Facebook and LinkedIn as well. So if there's any questions for us, let us know. Remember that Frances is always there to help. She's a wonderful resource and she has folks that help her. She's just not a one showman person. So even though she's slammed, I know that she always has others that she can have talk with you as well. So please join us again for our next Less Stress Parenting webinar. Share it with your friends. Again, we're just here to try to give you resources in the community. So with that, thank you so much, Frances. Thank you so much to those of you who attended. We will have this recording posted and we will share that with you next week. So thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this session and that you found it incredibly informative, just like we did.